Captain Brennan told Staff Sergeant Raina Dalmar to stay with the vehicles. His exact words were that this was a job for combat controllers, not some logistics NCO who happened to have a radio. The Taliban fighters had pinned down 3rd Platoon in a valley 6 clicks west, and they needed precision airstrikes, not someone playing hero. But Raina had spent 4 years as a Joint Terminal Attack Controller before her transfer, had called in over 200 combat missions, and she knew something Brennan didn't. The weather window was closing in 8 minutes, and by the time his people got into position, those soldiers would be dead. Staff Sergeant Raina Dalmar was 31 years old and currently standing in the motor pool at Forward Operating Base Kandahar, watching Captain Brennan's convoy prepare for emergency deployment. The afternoon sun had turned the desert into something that hurt to look at, all white light and dust that got into everything. She held her radio handset loosely, monitoring 3 frequencies simultaneously while mechanics finished their final checks on the mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles. Raina had been at FOB Kandahar for 6 months, managing supply logistics for a brigade combat team. It was important work, making sure ammunition and equipment reached the soldiers who needed it, but it wasn't the work she'd trained for. Before her current assignment, she'd spent 4 years with the 13th Air Support Operations Squadron, coordinating close air support missions in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. She'd earned her JTAC certification at 23, one of the youngest controllers in her squadron, and the only woman in her training class. The convoy vehicles rumbled to life, diesel engines loud enough to make conversation difficult. Raina checked her watch and listened to the frantic radio traffic coming from 3rd Platoon's position. They were taking effective fire from multiple positions, possibly mortars, and their forward observer was down. Someone needed to talk to the fighter jets circling overhead, and they needed it now. If you want to hear more stories about veterans who stepped up when it mattered most, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told. Raina's father had been an air traffic controller at a civilian airport in New Mexico, and she'd grown up listening to him guide aircraft through difficult approaches during monsoon season. He'd taught her that calm voices saved lives, that panic was contagious, but so was confidence. She'd spent her childhood at the airport, watching planes land and take off, learning the rhythm of radio communication before she understood what most of the words meant. Her mother had been different but equally influential. She'd worked as an emergency dispatcher for 20 years, taking calls from people during the worst moments of their lives. She'd taught Raina that helping people under pressure wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being the calmest, about processing information when everyone else was overwhelmed, about making decisions with incomplete data because waiting for perfect information meant people died. When Raina joined the Air Force at 19, she'd known exactly what she wanted to do. She'd worked her way through the Joint Terminal Attack Controller pipeline, learning to direct aircraft during combat operations. It was one of the most demanding specializations in the military, requiring perfect communication with both ground forces and pilots while managing complex airspace and weapons parameters. Controllers had to think in 3 dimensions, tracking friendly positions, enemy locations, aircraft altitude, weapons ranges, and danger close calculations simultaneously. She'd been good at it. Better than good. In 4 years, she'd coordinated over 200 close air support missions without a single friendly fire incident. She'd talked pilots through night strikes, bad weather approaches, and situations where the margin for error was measured in meters. Then she'd transferred to logistics, partly because the promotion opportunities were better, partly because 4 years of high-stress combat operations had worn her down more than she'd wanted to admit. She'd told herself she was ready for something quieter. Most days she believed it. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Morrison's voice from 3rd Platoon. His unit was trapped in a narrow valley with high ground on 3 sides. They had wounded soldiers who couldn't move, and the Taliban fighters had positioned themselves perfectly to prevent any kind of extraction. Morrison was requesting immediate close air support, and he sounded like someone trying very hard not to sound terrified. Captain Brennan grabbed the handset from his vehicle and responded that his team was mounting up now. They had a certified JTAC and would be on station in approximately 20 minutes. He told Morrison to mark his position with smoke and keep his head down. Raina was running calculations in her head. 20 minutes to cover 6 kilometers of rough terrain, another 5 to 10 minutes to set up equipment and establish positive control with the aircraft. The 2 F-16s overhead were already reporting bingo fuel in 30 minutes, which meant they'd have to return to base for refueling soon. And the weather forecast showed a dust storm moving in from the west, expected to hit their area in less than 15 minutes. She approached Captain Brennan's vehicle and told him there wasn't time, that they needed someone to start coordinating with those aircraft immediately, or 3rd Platoon would lose their air cover entirely. Brennan had looked at her like she'd suggested something obscene. He told her, not unkindly, that he understood her background, but this wasn't a logistics problem. Close air support required current certification, recent training, and command authority that she didn't have. He appreciated her concern, but she needed to stay in her lane. Master Sergeant Kyle Torres, Brennan's senior enlisted advisor, had been less diplomatic. He'd stepped between them and said that JTAC work was too critical to hand off to someone who'd been pushing paperwork for 6 months. That she might have done this job once, but combat controllers had to maintain proficiency, and there was no way she was still sharp enough to handle a troops in contact situation. Rayna had pointed out that she'd been listening to the radio traffic and could already visualize the tactical situation, that she knew the aircraft call signs, their weapons loadout, and exactly how much time they had before losing air support entirely. That every minute spent arguing was a minute 3rd Platoon didn't have. Brennan had told her to monitor the radio from the TOC and provide support if needed, then climbed into his vehicle. The convoy rolled out, leaving Rayna standing in the motor pool with a radio and no authority to use it. She stood there for approximately 30 seconds before making a decision that would either save lives or end her career. Rayna walked quickly back to the Tactical Operations Center, her mind already shifting into the patterns she'd trained for years to develop. She wasn't thinking about Brennan's orders or Torres's dismissal. She was thinking about Lieutenant Morrison's voice on the radio, about the sound that came through when someone was trying to stay professional while their soldiers were dying. She'd heard that sound before, in Helmand Province, when a Marine patrol had been ambushed and their JTAC had taken shrapnel to the chest. Rayna had been the closest qualified controller, and she'd talked an A-10 pilot through a gun run that was so close to friendly forces that the Marines had felt the brass casings hitting their helmets. She'd made that call knowing that any mistake would kill the people she was trying to save. The thing that made her angry wasn't being questioned. She understood chain of command, understood that protocols existed for good reasons. What made her angry was the assumption that somehow 6 months away from the job had erased 4 years of experience. That the skills she'd built had somehow evaporated because she was currently managing supply inventories instead of directing airstrikes. She thought about the young soldiers in 3rd Platoon, most of them barely old enough to drink legally. They didn't care about anyone's career concerns or certification status. They needed someone who could bring steel and fire down on their enemies accurately enough to save their lives. She could do that. She'd done it hundreds of times, but if she bypassed Brennan's authority and took control of this mission, there would be consequences. The best-case scenario was a career-ending reprimand. Worst case, if something went wrong, she could face criminal charges for operating outside her designated role during combat operations. She picked up the radio handset anyway. Rayna switched to the air frequency and transmitted using proper protocol. She identified herself with her old call sign, gave her grid coordinates, and requested direct communication with the fighter aircraft on station. The pilot's response came back immediately, professional and clipped. He confirmed 2 F-16s with mixed ordnance, 30 minutes of fuel remaining, and he needed positive identification of friendly positions before committing any weapons. She pulled up the digital mapping system and cross-referenced Morrison's last known position with the terrain data. The valley was approximately 400 meters long and 200 meters wide, with ridge lines on 3 sides rising about 60 meters above the valley floor. Morrison had reported taking fire from at least 2 positions on the eastern ridge and 1 on the northern end. That meant the enemy had overlapping fields of fire and could cover any evacuation route. She contacted Morrison directly and walked him through the 9-line brief, the standardized format for close air support requests. She needed him to confirm friendly positions, mark them with infrared strobes that the pilots could see through their targeting pods, and give her exact locations for enemy contacts. Morrison's voice came back shaky but functional. He reported 6 friendly personnel at the southern end of the valley, 3 of them wounded. Enemy positions were approximately 300 meters north and east. He was marking his position now with IR strobes. The lead F-16 pilot confirmed visual contact with the strobes. He could see what looked like muzzle flashes from 2 positions on the eastern ridge. He was requesting clearance to employ ordnance. This was the moment that separated qualified controllers from dead soldiers. Rayner needed to calculate danger-close distances, verify that no friendly forces were inside the blast radius, confirm that the pilots understood the ground situation well enough to execute safely, and make the final call to clear weapons hot, all while knowing that Captain Brennan's convoy was still 15 minutes out and would arrive to find her completely outside her authority. The radio crackled with a new voice. It was Brennan, and he was demanding to know what she thought she was doing, telling her to cease all communications immediately and let his JTAC handle this when they arrived on scene. Rayner looked at her watch. The dust storm was 8 minutes out. The aircraft had 26 minutes of fuel. Brennan's convoy was still 12 minutes from the valley. She did the math and knew that waiting meant 3rd Platoon lost their air support entirely. She transmitted to Brennan that she understood his position, but weather and fuel constraints required immediate action. Then she switched back to the fighter frequency before he could respond. The lead pilot was asking for clearance again. His weapons system was locked onto the eastern ridge position. He needed authorization to engage. Rayner's voice was perfectly calm when she cleared the first strike. She gave the pilot final confirmation of friendly positions, verified his weapons parameters, and said the words that authorized him to release ordnance. She watched the targeting feed on the TOC display as the pilot rolled in, his aircraft dropping from 15,000 feet into attack position. The first bomb hit exactly where it needed to, the explosion bright even on the black and white thermal display. The pilot pulled up and called off target. Rayner was already coordinating the second aircraft, directing him to the northern enemy position. She walked him through the approach, confirmed the target lock and cleared him to engage. Morrison's voice came through almost immediately after the second explosion. The enemy fire had stopped. He was organizing his soldiers for evacuation and needed to know if close air support would remain available during their movement. This was where Rayner's experience mattered most. She knew the fuel calculations, knew exactly how long those aircraft could remain on station before they hit their bingo minimum. She told Morrison he had a 9-minute window where she could guarantee air cover. After that, he'd be on his own until the next package arrived. Morrison rogered and began moving his people. Rayner kept both aircraft in holding patterns above the valley, ready to strike if enemy forces reappeared. She monitored 3 radio frequencies simultaneously, tracking Morrison's progress, maintaining communication with the pilots, and listening to Brennan's convoy getting closer. The dust storm hit 6 minutes later, exactly when the forecast had predicted. Visibility dropped to near zero on the ground, but the pilots could still see through their infrared systems. One of them reported possible movement on the western ridge, potentially enemy fighters trying to reposition during the storm. Rayner made a decision that would later be analyzed in training schools. She directed the aircraft to make a show of force pass over the western ridge, low enough that anyone down there would hear the engines and know they were being watched. No weapons released, but the message was clear. The pilot executed perfectly, his F-16 screaming through the valley at 500 feet altitude. Morrison reported that his unit had reached the extraction point. All personnel were accounted for. He was requesting to know the call sign of whoever had been running that air support, because he wanted to personally thank them for saving his soldiers' lives. Captain Brennan's convoy arrived 4 minutes later. By then, the fighter aircraft had departed for refueling. Morrison's platoon was being evacuated by helicopter, and Rayner was sitting in the TOC, writing up her after-action report. Brennan walked in looking like someone who'd just had the longest 20 minutes of his life. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then asked her to step outside. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. Brennan was angry that she'd disregarded his direct order. He was worried about the precedent it set, about what happened when soldiers decided they knew better than their chain of command. But he was also looking at a situation where 6 soldiers were alive because Reyna had made a call that went against protocol. Master Sergeant Torres was the one who changed the dynamic. He'd been listening to the radio traffic during the drive, heard every transmission Reyna made. He told Brennan in front of Reyna that what she'd done was technically perfect, that her 9-line brief had been flawless, her weapons clearances properly executed, and her coordination with the pilots was as good as any JTAC he'd worked with in 15 years. The formal investigation took 3 weeks. Reyna submitted to multiple interviews, provided detailed justification for every decision she'd made, and accepted that her career might be over. The investigating officer reviewed all the radio recordings, talked to the pilots who'd executed the mission, and interviewed Lieutenant Morrison and his soldiers. His final report concluded that Staff Sergeant Dalmar had acted outside her assigned duties, but within her qualified capabilities. That her decision to engage had been tactically sound, given the time constraints and weather factors. That her execution had been professionally exemplary. He recommended no disciplinary action, with the caveat that such situations should be avoided through better planning and resource allocation. But the real change happened more quietly. Captain Brennan requested that Reyna be reassigned to his unit as their primary JTAC. He told his commander that having someone with her experience managing logistics had been a waste of capability. Within a month, she was back to doing the job she'd trained for, calling in air support for combat operations. 6 months later, she was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to the JTAC training school at Nellis Air Force Base. Her mission was to develop new training, scenarios that focused on time-critical situations and decision-making under pressure. She used her own experience that day as a case study, teaching new controllers that sometimes the right call meant accepting personal risk to accomplish the mission. Lieutenant Morrison stayed in contact with her. He sent her a photo of his platoon with a note that said simply, "Thank you for not waiting." 3 of the soldiers in that photo had been wounded that day but survived. All 6 had gone home to their families. Reyna kept the photo on her desk, not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that expertise didn't evaporate because someone changed jobs. That the most important qualifications weren't written on paper, but lived in muscle memory and judgment developed through hundreds of repetitions. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust your own capabilities when everyone else said you shouldn't. They'd called for air support that day, but what 3rd Platoon really needed was someone who refused to let bureaucracy get soldiers killed, someone who'd been the storm before and knew exactly how to bring it when lives were on the line.